I've chosen three paintings to talk with you about in regard to the elements of art and the principles of design. There's a video in your folder, an important video that really breaks it down into tiny pieces. The video is about 15 minutes long, and I think it gives you some clarity. But in addition, we'll look at some paintings and talk about the elements and principles. After that, I will have a couple of paintings that you can choose from, and I want you. This is your assignment this week, is to list the elements that you see in the painting and the principles that are being used in the design aspect. So this first one is called the School of Athens. It's an Italian Renaissance painting by Raphael. The dates are 14th century. We'll just go with that. And it was a time, Renaissance, you have to look at the history, take a look at purpose and function and what's going on during this time period. And as the Renaissance was a rebirth, it was a period in history of great wealth and abundance. And whenever you find money, you find great inventions. So this is one of the greatest paintings in the world, and we're going to really break it down and talk a little bit about, of course, the symbolism behind this, the story behind this painting is that it's known as the marriage of art, philosophy, and science, which is at one time art was in that category, and artists were revered in the same way that the scientists are the philosopher. So I'm going to stop here for a minute, and then we're going to take a deeper look into the elements and principles of design. The best way is to break this down is to break down and look at each individual element. And we'll start with line and understand that line is really no line exists in reality. You have edges where one plane meets another, where one value sits next to another one to show some kind of light and shadow. There are lines and patterns in fabrics, and they're certainly used in design, but it's an invention by artists to represent a form. And so not a lot of line going on in this painting. The next one, though, is shape, and you could say something like shapes are, or if we were to write about this, and you will be writing about it, not this one, but another one, I would say something like shapes are organic, there's architectural forms in the background that are geometric in nature, the figures in the foreground and middle ground are organic. The next step would be value. There is a value in the painting, a range of values from lights and darks. Shadows and highlights are representing create a round three-dimensional form. So in talking about texture, there are two types of texture, implied and actual. We would say this is an implied texture. It is an illusion of fabric. It's not an actual texture that you can feel and touch. The implied texture, I would have to describe it as being smooth, references fabric, concrete walls. The color, we can say, somewhat neutralized. It may have to do with the history of the painting in terms of varnish, and sometimes these paintings were much brighter than when they've come in and restored them and cleaned the varnish off and redid the painting. Color just pops out and is much more intense, but these look pretty neutral. There's a lot of white added, a lot of tint. And then in your shadow areas, you have a more brown, darker, grayish color to create that depth and volume. Warm colors come forward. Cool colors like the blue sky recede in space. Depth, the last element to talk about, is a process that artists went through during the Renaissance to create, in theory, how to create something going back in space. And they discovered that a thing called linear perspective, where all your diagonals would go back to one point at your horizon line, which is just above the artist, the two figures in the center, and that just above their heads would be your vanishing point. And so all these lines and the diagonals that you see would converge to that point. So you could literally take a ruler and start drawing those diagonals to that area of the painting. The other thing is a thing called overlapping, and as forms go back in space too, they also get smaller. So you have the overlapping figure, then you have the figures decreasing in scale. Then there's an atmospheric perspective where the colors begin to neutralize and go gray, where your color in the foreground is more intense and clear and crisp to bring them forward in space. The principles of design are basically if you were to compare to the written language, the elements of art would be like words, and the principles of design are like commas, paragraph structure, capital letters. It organizes the elements and pulls it together so the compositions begin to work. When I work with my students in painting and drawing, the painting is usually to say, well, it's not finished. When do you know when a painting is finished or not? If something's odd, something's not working, and oftentimes it will have to do with that composition and your principles of design. So there's 4 basic ones that we'll take a look at this semester. There's a lot more, but for a beginning art appreciation class, I think if we can understand a thing called symmetry, has to do with balance. In this case, what's on the left is on the right. If you take a line and go right down through the center between these 2 major figures, and what you separate and look at this, that's your central axis, by the way, that longest line from top to bottom. You divide that painting in half. Basically, what's on the left is on the right. There's some variation, of course, in the forms and the movement and colors, but it's pretty much a symmetrical composition. The focal point is obviously where the 2 main figures are and where your vanishing point is. Contrast is created primarily, I think, through color. Contrast is created somewhat through shape, and the figures are in contrast to the architectural forms in the background. And then I think the last one is repetition, rhythm. Correct me if I don't have all 4 of these in here, but rhythm and repetition is also a unifier. And all 4 of these these principles that we talk about have to do with unifying a composition, pulling it together so it makes sense. If you try to write an essay and it's going all over the place and you got words here and there and it doesn't make any sense, you can't communicate to anyone if it's not organized. And that's what the principles of design do. They organize the elements. The next painting that we'll take a look at is a beautiful little fresco from Pompeii. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Pompeii, but it's a very famous city that was completely covered through a volcanic eruption and became a permanent structure that now it's like a huge graveyard where the ash covered bodies and buildings. And this was a very kind of rare archaeological. They were digging up and discovered this little fresco in a palace. And it was in perfect condition because of the way the ash from the volcano had sealed the structure, and so the humidity, the heat, the sun did not damage the fresco. the thing to look at on this one, and again, we can break it down and talk about the elements, and we have like, say, organic shapes and some, in the fruit, and then there's some geometric shapes in the background. You can talk about volume, round and three-dimensional. Now that's a real hard and tough thing when you think about this is done in around 80 AD. And these people were really, really smart because it's a tough thing to master, to take a flat shape or a flat object, create an illusion of it being a three-dimensional form. It's a three-dimensional form. You make a circle, it's flat. But then to add value and lights and shadows to create volume is tough. It's a hard thing to do. So you also have this beautiful clear glass vase. You can really see through that. You can see the water line, the edges, the reflection on the glass. And that's a tough one too. That's a very educated person back in 80 AD who did this fresco. So we talk about shapes being organic. Colors are neutralized. They're pretty toned down. They're not bright, intense color. They're soft and neutralized. And that means gray has been added to the bright color of yellow and green. Whites have been added, and shades and darks have been added in the shadows. There is some overlapping in the painting. There is some depth going on through color primarily. There's not any linear perspective, but there is some overlapping forms, and colors do recede as they go back in space. Also, details are simplified as they go back in space. So I would have to say the depth in the painting is somewhat shallow. It would not be the deep space that we saw in the School of Athens. The texture of the painting is implied. It is an illusion of a pear. I would have to say there's a nice rhythm. There's in the principle of design. The thing I'm seeing it has to do with this sort of movement or motion, nice rhythm that runs in the stem, and then there's a series of repeated planes in the background. They almost look like they're sitting on steps of some sort, a table, surface, bookshelf maybe. But you see a repetition of the organic shape over and over again. Again, that is a unifier. The contrast has to do with the geometric background with the organic pear. And what did I leave out? Symmetry. This would be asymmetrically balanced. It is still a balanced painting, but the symmetry occurs a little differently than your symmetry in the School of Athens. And this asymmetrical balance, two shapes represent a large shape. There's a sense of unity going on, but they've balanced out. I see the vase is being balanced by this little red flower coming in on the left-hand side. So I'll stop here, and I have one more for you, and then I want you to do this too. Okay, the last one to talk about is Van Gogh. Of course, I think this is like a super famous painting. You see it on coffee cups and greeting cards. It's everywhere. It's been repeated. Everybody loved the post-impressionist. Vincent Van Gogh he's also quite a character. There's been movies written about him. And he had quite a personality that was made for, big movies. And he has quite a history that's quite interesting. If you want to know more about Van Gogh, you can look him up. Google Van Gogh, VanGogh, and this will pop up. So the thing in looking at this painting is that Right off the back, I'm going to talk about texture because you don't really see the texture in a surface like photograph, but there's a lot of texture to the paint. A lot of paint, very thick paint, is you can feel the texture of the paint. So it would be like an actual texture. It's symbolic. It's not an illusion of a sun, but a symbolic reference to the sun. He's captured the wind in the painting, all this movement and swirling, multiple stars that are swollen and very expressionistic. It's a symbol about his interior feelings, so it's not going to have the accuracy of form that you would see in School of Athens. The purpose and function of this painting was very different. So if we back up again and look at, I would say this is a cool palette. Shapes are organic. Cool palette meaning blues and greens. The more description you can put into your elements and principles of design, the better, because it's really a matter of, it helps you really study and look at the work of art to determine and see. The more you look and the more you write about it, the more you see, and the more you see, and the more you see.